Hello, everyone. I'm Soledad Davies. I am the founder and director of Psychosematica. And today is a great honor to have Nicolas Campion today at Psychosematica. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hi, Soledad.
Let me introduce you first. Nicolas Campion is an historian of astrology and cultural astronomy. He's also the director of the Sophia Centre associated to the University of Wales, and the director of the Masters in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology, and also the Master in Ecology and Spirituality. He's also the author of many books on astrology and the relationship between culture and astrology, and some of which are of the huge reference in the study of astrology, such as the History of Astrology and many volumes and different books and papers on this topic. And he's also my dear professor and a great inspiration to me. So thank you, Nick, to be here. And it's a pleasure to talk with you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Soledad.
I would like to talk about the history of astrology, regarding also all your background. Your journey is extremely vast, many years of experience in the study of astrology, and also your contributions to the study of astrology are very significant, in particular, not only because of your publications and your books, but also for the creation of the Sophia Center, which is the only center in the world dedicated to the academic study on the history of astrology and astrology in culture. So first of all, thank you very much for your huge contribution to the study of astrology. So given all this background, I would like to know what are your personal insights, or what personal insights has the study of the history of astrology brought to your conception of astrology?
Well, I began to study the history of astrology about the time that I began to look into the study of astrology itself, because I was an undergraduate studying history. I became very fascinated by the existence of astrology in the modern world. I discovered that it had been part of the medieval university curriculum. And so from then on, I just set out to study the history of it. I realized that in order to study the history of something, you need to know what it is, how to practice it, how it works, and so on. So I taught myself how to interpret and read horoscopes in the modern style, which was all that was available then, which is the 1970s. But understanding the history of astrology was always my first love, and that became reinforced when I began to realize that in modern astrology, by which I mean 40 years ago, there were competing schools of thought, quite a few of which regarded other schools of thought or practice as not proper astrology. And then I'd had enough of this kind of denunciation of other people, because I think it's completely ridiculous when some people claim to be the authentic thing and accuse other people of somehow deviating from the authentic thing. So we've got something as flexible and variable as astrology, which it's possible to approach from almost any perspective. It seems to me that there can be no true position, and so I just became fascinated looking at all the different positions, because they've all got a lineage, right? So you might have, in 2023, people arguing about what astrology can do or what it is, but they've all got a lineage that goes back in all cases to classical Greece in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC, and before that to Babylon. And so I just became fascinated by astrology as a sort of survival in the modern world. And I don't mean by survival as it's a fossil, it's a living survival, but it's a survival from before Christianity in the West, before science.
Yes, I can see exactly what you are describing. these kind of tensions and discussions on philosophical currents within astrology, or the search for the true astrology, especially now that we are in the context of a lot of revivals and new information and new discoveries somehow. So at least in the Spanish speaking astrological community, this is very alive. So in this regard, what do you think? You can see this description, you can see the problematic. So what do you see and your opinion of astrology today, or what is the future of astrology in this regard? What is your opinion?
Astrology today, I'm finding, I'm looking for the innovation actually, because there was a great deal of innovation in astrology at several stages in the 20th century. So the first stage of innovation was in the response to the work of Carl Jung, who was he was keen on astrology, didn't particularly practice, but other people cast horoscopes for him and his clients. So there was a great response to that beginning in the 1920s in Germany. That's one phase. Around the same time as that, there's a great response to theosophy and development of an astrology of the soul. And then if you go forward to the post-Second World War period, in the 1970s, there's the development of a real psychological astrology based totally on understanding the dynamics of the psyche. And then a formulation of astrology as divination, which started in the UK, and which challenges the idea that there's any fixed truth in any astrological symbol, and which also some of the psychologists would do as well. And then also in the 80s, the beginnings of this sort of looking back to the past, the discovery of 17th century texts. And then in the early 90s, the discovery of Hellenistic texts, their translation, and that a lot of people started practicing as medieval astrologers or Hellenistic astrologers. So that all happened by the mid-90s. So when I look at astrology now, I think all that material is still being digested. And what I do see is that whereas at that time in the 80s and 90s, there's quite a lot of polarization. It seems to me that we've now got people learning astrology who were born in the 21st century, for whom those innovations in the 80s and 90s and that polarization that happened took place before they were born. So I encounter young astrologers now who will be studying a little bit of reincarnational astrology, which is really 20th century, take a course in 17th century horary astrology, and do a bit else besides. So I think it's become very eclectic. And of course there's also the democratization of social media. And it was always the case in astrology that there were like two career routes, but in the 20th century anyway, and I think before. So you could either work your way through like an institutional model and study and become a teacher and become an expert in, the casting of horoscopes and get involved in an astrology school and astrology societies. And then there's the popular route, often distrusted by the institutional people. So the popular route was always available to people who could write in the newspapers and women's magazines.
Or social media today.
But now you see, it's become social media. And so I always feel that actually success as an astrological consultant was often dependent on personality. And if you could communicate with people, you would get a clientele. But until say 20 years ago, you could only draw your clientele from people who lived close to you.
Yes.
Unless you were doing a postal
The
service.
word of mouth.
Exactly. So now all that's changed. If you've got the right expressive personality, you create, you're on Instagram, you create you've got a YouTube channel, you can get clients from anywhere in the world, you can promote yourself easily. So there's a huge world of social media, internet astrology. Like there's a huge world of social media and internet everything.
Yeah,
Which is a new phenomenon, which completely alters the dynamics. I'm not sure how, because nobody studied how. It may be that the prevalence of individual influences and so on then attracts people who study with schools and get diplomas. But the core language of astrology remains, right? Which is there's a horoscope, there's zodiac signs, there's houses, there's aspects, and that core language is 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
And even though there's a huge amount of innovation, that core language has remained very stable.
Yeah. I'm thinking also one of your questions about if is it possible really to talk about a modern astrology, since the paradigm of astrology and to read a natal chart is anti-modern, is in opposition to modernity and the modern paradigm. So can we talk about a modern astrology, even if the cosmology of astrology remains traditional? I think that is a very interesting reflection.
I think we can talk about a modern astrology. We just have to know what we mean by modern. I mean, here we come to sort of language complications, because we can have different conversations in French, German, Spanish, English, Chinese, right? Words like science change their meaning as they cross language boundaries. So if we look at the word modern, right, within the English language, we've got a concept of modernity, which is a progress-oriented concept which prioritizes the idea of the world as completely materialistic. Everything's a machine, and there's also a metaphysical progress towards a rational atheist future from a superstitious past. And so within that framework, modernity, astrology is a dangerous superstition which needs to be stamped out. And so academics look at astrology from that perspective, try to solve the conundrum of why it is that people believe in astrology when it should have died out. But that's a sort of nonsense, because they're looking at a metaphysical theory which says it should have died out. Modern. Then when we got cultural modernism, and I know in Spain, modernism in the late 19th century was a name for what in France became known as Art Nouveau. But so we've got, artistic cultural modernism, and there we encompass all sorts of people who were deeply into various forms of what for modernity is forbidden knowledge, including astrology. So poets like W.B. Yeats, André Breton, who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, quite a number of people, and a lot of people, quite a number into theosophy as well, like painters like Vasilis Kandinsky. So it was those spiritual elements in early 20th century culture which had a profound influence on cultural modernism and the search for the future. So if we look at self-declared modern astrology, Alan Leo, is the great pioneer of the soul in astrology. He published a journal called Modern Astrology. And in the middle of the 20th century, Margaret Hone, who was a great sort of institutional person, she was principal of the Faculty of Astrological Studies, the main teaching school in the English-speaking world. She wrote a textbook called The Textbook of Modern Astrology.
Yeah.
So they delineate what modern astrology is. So modern astrology is then technically very simple, right? It's lost a lot of the complicated structures of analyzing horoscopes. So, but it deals in character analysis or personality analysis, and then it shifts from there in the 70s into looking at the dynamics of the psyche in a sort of Jungian, Freudian manner. So that I think is clearly, we can say that's a modern astrology, but we can align it with cultural modernism. When the traditional revival started, a few people started looking at that as postmodern, and as I did. And that's a useful phrase, because postmodern, actually, one of the characteristics of it is the recovery of the past, or a disenchantment with modernity. So, but not necessarily disenchantment with cultural modernism. Okay, a disenchantment with that atheist, rationalist, technological, machine age kind of modernity, in which everything has to be simple, and the reader and the rediscovery, we're looking back to something which is perceived to be more authentic. I mean, I know some of the people who were the early advocates of the traditional Hellenistic revival regarded psychological astrology, some of them said, as not proper astrology, or as sort of having lost some great truth that they identified in the old texts, about which personally I think there are questions to be asked of those old texts, because I think that there's an assumption amongst many contemporary astrologers that those old texts provide a more accurate way of working than simplified modern astrology would. But I think that it's very difficult to judge whether one way of working is more accurate than another. But so much of it depends on interpretation, because if you look at sometimes when the rules of technical astrology are set out, they always are written as if they lead logically to a final answer, but actually usually they don't. For example, if you look at the great collection of horary charts in English from William Lilly's Christian Astrology, the first great astrology textbook in English from 1647. They're all retrospective examples, and in each case he's playing around with the rules, which is not to it's not to say he's being insincere or anything like that, but there's always a human input. There's always an input.
Yes. Of course.
And I've looked at Guido Bonatti's horoscopes for castle besiegement from 14th century Italy, and it's the same thing. He gives retrospective examples, and it's clear there's no boundary between what a rule of astrology says and where human agency comes in, whether human agency is the interpretation of the astrologer or the actions of the people who are being inquired about. So I think the idea that turning back to the past provides something better or more authentic is I think not, well, I would disagree with it, because I think it's not taking into account that human element.
The interpreter in the cultural and historical context of the interpreter also. And in this regard, talking about culture, astrology, and the sky, I would like if you can tell us how did the creation of the Sophia Center come about, and what is the work that you do that is very connected to what we were talking actually?
Well, the Sophia Centre we started teaching in 2002, and there was a lead up to that. So in the mid-90s, I decided I wanted to return to the academic life. I decided I was basically happiest in libraries, reading and writing. That's why you can see the books behind me. If I turn my webcam around, you'd see thousands of books.
That there is more.
Yeah.
I understand completely.
Yeah. So, and I decided, I started looking at returning to the academic world, which I'd left in 1976. And there was, I had to find a topic for a PhD, and eventually I settled on looking at the nature of contemporary belief in astrology. And the reason was I was always being phoned up by journalists who would typically say, we're doing a story on astrology and the editor wants me to find out how many people believe in it. And of course, nobody really knew.
Yeah.
So I decided to take this on as a PhD topic, which I did part-time for 6 years. In the 5th year, I realized that the problem is the word belief. To ask people if they believe in things is basically the pointless question. It makes much more sense to ask people what they do. So anyway, I produced my PhD, and that was at a small UK university called Bath Spa University. I was in a study of religions department where I learned a huge amount about how religions are viewed and studied in academia now. I learned the skills of an anthropologist. And partway through that process, we launched the program called it the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. We put cultural astronomy first because I was already engaged in a network of people who are looking at astronomy and culture. There's a group called the Inspiration of Astronomical Phenomena. There was a series of conferences, the Oxford conferences on archaeoastronomy and cultural astronomy. So, and it seemed to me sensible to bring the two together because astrologers they base in what they do. The starting point is on observational astronomy. Where are the planets and stars? And also, in most cultures at most times, including the West before 17th century, the line between what constitutes astrology as a search for meaning and astronomy as measurement is very blurred and sometimes doesn't exist at all. So we created the program. That was at Bath Spa University as a physical campus. Being on a physical campus made it difficult to recruit sufficient students to keep a master's program going. So in 2007, I moved to the University of Wales, now the University of Wales Trinity St David, and we launched as a distance program in January 2008. And it's sort of the only academic program in the world which looks at, from any perspective, how human beings engage with the sky. So particularly the stars and planets, but hey, there's clouds there as well, and colors.
Why do you think that these kind of studies are important, especially for those who are doing a kind of training on astrology or are interested in astrology? What do you think, or why do you think that is important, this kind of study on the history of astrology on the one hand, and on the other hand, what is your opinion of astrology in academics from now onwards?
On the first question, I mean, for me, I'm a great partisan for the study of history. I think it's the ultimate liberating discipline, because if you come at it without preconceptions, then you learn a huge amount about the world, the way it may operate, and our own personal place within it. And you also I think, gather the personal information understanding to reject an awful lot of the myths which are fed to us by through politics, through religion, through science, whatever else. And you know, you're able to judge for yourself. So when it comes to astrology, you know, I mentioned how in the early 80s, I became quite bemused by the fact that there were astrologers sitting in different camps arguing about who was the real astrologer. There's a great film everybody should watch called The Life of Brian. It had a huge influence on me because this film satirizes revolutionary political groups who spend more time fighting each other than pursuing a cause. And so I just think so. Anyway, I had that view on competing camps of astrologers, and so I think it's just really important if you are studying or practicing anything. I think it helps to know about wider contexts and issues, and you know, it's all to do with wisdom and understanding. As far as in academia is concerned, well, you know, we're the only dedicated master's program. There are individual academics around the world looking at the history of astrology. They're sometimes based in history and philosophy of science departments. So they often have to, they're working in a department but pursuing their private studies. In terms of the cultural astronomy side of things, there's a program, I think it's in Colorado, but which focuses very much on archaeoastronomy, which is archaeology and astronomy. Of course, if we're looking at vocational astrology in universities, then we'd look to India, where in the last 20 years, various universities started teaching traditional Indian astrology, so supported by the Indian government, but to the disquiet of some academics there. But anyway, so that's it. That only happens in India. So so in the in my area, I just hope that in the University of Wales Trinity St David we continue to flourish. We take on PhD students. We have a good intake of master's students, and the online environment works really well for us.
And the importance of research on these topics, not only assume on these topics.
Exactly. Exactly. So, our research can be historical, sociological, anthropological, philosophical. We just had one student complete a PhD on the question of astrology and truth. So that was more like a philosophical investigation. How do we judge whether astrology is true? And I've got, and we've got other graduates in terms of PhDs who've looked at astrology and fate, astrology and the internet. One of our students, Laura Andrikopoulos, just graduated after writing her PhD on the psychologization of astrology in the 20th century.
Interesting.
So yeah, that's the kind of thing we do, and we do bring out get that material out into the public eye, which I think culturally makes a lot more sense than just saying, oh, astrology is a superstition or something. Because if you took that approach to everything, then the whole of the humanities would be closed down, because the feature of the humanities in universities is we study what people actually do, without being judgmental or without saying, well, is this true or not? We just look at what people do, try and understand what
is happening, and trying to understand exactly.
And so we went ahead with this notion of the critical study of astrology, its history, philosophy, and so on. So that's a very, very central distinction.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. And for those who are interested in those topics and you want to have a glimpse on that, in November we are doing a course on the history of astronomy with Nicholas Campion as a professor. So please take this great opportunity to study with him, which is very insightful. So you are all welcome to participate. All English and Spanish speaking astrologers are welcome. So thank you very much for sharing with me, Nick, and looking forward to do the history of astrology course.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Soledad.
Yeah, thank you very much, and see you soon.
I'm looking forward to the course as well.
Yes. Thank you, Nick. Bye.
Bye.